Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Science Literacy Week discussion on how we can make ourselves more scientifically literate and what we can do to advance the science that we need to keep us healthy and safe, not just during this pandemic, or clearly during this pandemic, but when the pandemic is finished as well. So thanks all for being here and for joining me and Anthony and Marianne. And we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Senator Stan Kuchar, independent senator from Nova Scotia. Anthony?
Yeah, my name is Anthony Morgan. I am a television broadcaster, a science communication researcher, a game designer, and an entrepreneur.
Wow.
That's a lot of things. That's a lot of things.
And tired.
My name is Dr. Marianne Mader, and I'm the executive director of the Canadian Association of Science Centers, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the network of science centers and science museums across the country. And I have a background actually in planetary science.
Wow, so we're pretty good. My background is medicine, mental health, and neurobiology. But so we got the area covered here a little bit, particularly with both of you. And let's start off. We're going to be talking about how to give people agency, whether that's personal agency, cultural agency, organizational agency. How do you give people agency during this time? And throughout the pandemic, we've been plagued with misinformation and disinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines. Governments and organizations have done lots of things, whatever they can do to mitigate this issue, but sometimes that's actually caused problems. But what can each of us as individuals do to address this infodemic that is so negatively impacting our lives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that all of us are asking ourselves on a regular basis. It's a very stressful time, and we'd all love to be out of it as soon as we can. I know that for many of us, myself included, many of us have relatives or family or friends who, let's say, aren't necessarily aligned with our perspective about how we should proceed as a society. Should we wear masks? Should we not? Should we get vaccines? Should we not? I know how I feel about those things, but a lot of people struggle with how to have conversations with their family or friends about these kinds of things. I know people who have lost touch with family or friends because of divisions about those kinds of things. And I think there is good advice about how to engage with these kinds of conversations with family and friends productively. My favorite example of it is a woman by the name of Megan Phelps Roper. She's not tied directly to the pandemic, but her example is a really good one. The first time I encountered her, I saw a photograph of her at like 4 years old, wearing a t-shirt that had a very unfortunate slogan. It was "God hates," and then you can fill in the blank. It was they were derogatory towards people of different sexual orientation or religious groups. She was part of the Westboro Baptist Church. And that's, if you're not familiar, it's a church that's really infamous for its hateful kinds of protests at funerals for service members and that sort of thing. And so she's 4 years old holding up a sign that says this. And when you think about people who are never going to change their minds, people who are lost causes, there's no point in talking to them. She's it. And the next photograph that I saw of her was her giving a TED talk about why she left the church, and what it took for that to happen. Surprisingly, it was partly to do with Twitter. She was having lots of conversations on Twitter. Many of them were of the variety you'd imagine, where people were screaming at her, calling her a horrible person, asking her how she could do these kinds of things. Doesn't she have any empathy? Is she even a human being? But none of these were the conversations that changed her mind. The conversations that did change her mind were the ones where people practiced curiosity with her, the ones where people genuinely tried to walk into understanding, how did you get to this place? And they weren't asking from a place of judgment. They were genuinely curious about her perspectives as a human being. And when you do that with somebody, when you walk into curiosity with them, and there are holes in the way that they think, then those holes, they kind of surface naturally. And so she came to the point that she saw so many of these holes, she just felt she couldn't continue with the church, and she made the the insanely courageous decision to leave everything she'd ever known behind, her family, her friends, all that scary stuff, because she just saw too many holes in what she believed. So in a nutshell, the advice I would give would be to step into curiosity and to not expect change overnight, that it does take lots of conversations. I think a lot of us want our friends and family to immediately believe what we believe right now, but that's typically not what we've seen from the research. So slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah, and actually, I would love to build on that, because I think in the context of the pandemic, you're having these conversations, you're finding common ground, and through empathy, through curiosity, and then people need information, right? I'm not a health expert. I'm a planetary scientist. You know, my family member is asking me something about the vaccine or whatever, and so there's this kind of next step of like, where do you find reputable information? The translation of scientific information into kind of the public sphere is doesn't always happen. And so we're all involved in an initiative called Science Up First, and it's helping to bridge those conversations of the science and making it accessible to the public. And it's really focused on sharing that information on social media platforms. But honestly, that information that's digestible has helped me in the in-person conversations, because I have some place to go to turn to. For me, as a friend, as a colleague, as a coworker, of, oh yeah, let me check on that. I'm going to go check out sciencefirst.com, find scienceupfirst.com as a place to check out. And of course, there's a list of reputable sources.
So
I think, yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, like, that's kind of like where to go for information that can be trusted. I think trust is so key when it comes to science communication. And then what happens when you come across something that you're like not sure about? And we've all faced it. And whether it's in a conversation with a family member or something, it's like, I don't know, that's maybe sounds reasonable, but I don't know. And so there's science behind how to tackle misinformation. So one of our key researchers, Timothy Caulfield, out at the Health Law Institute in University of Alberta, this is an area of research about how do you tackle misinformation, and sharing accurate information that's accessible is scientifically proven to make a difference. Sometimes it might not feel like it's making a difference, like, I'm going to share this thing on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, but it is scientifically proven to help into that cause. So I think there's a really quick win for anyone who believes in, like, who kind of makes decisions based on evidence, that to share factual information and make that part of your routine, because debunking works. It helps in how we're facing this pandemic.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Anthony.
We'll let you in eventually.
Go on.
So one of the pieces of research that I came across in the as I was thinking about this problem, so my PhD research is focusing on the problem of polarization. How do we communicate about these kinds of things in polarized environments? So when people don't have already preformed opinions about things, the standard set of tools for science communication are very effective. But when those ideas are connected to identity, whether they're connected to your liberal or your conservative, then we need a more nuanced bag of tricks at that point. And so the research that I came across that was really interesting that highlighted this is they would basically take a bunch of liberals, a bunch of conservatives, and they'd stick them in an MRI scanner, and they would tell them a bunch of ideas, or share a bunch of ideas that contradicted what they believed. And what the researchers found was that it dramatically activated the threat part of our brain. And what we know is that when we feel threatened, especially socially threatened, when we feel like we might not be part of the in-group if these ideas are true, then that is one of the strongest threat responses that human beings have. And what we want to try to do in those kinds of polarized situations is avoid activating the threat responses. And so really that's when those strategies around empathy and compassion become very valuable, but they have to be paired with what Marianne was speaking about, where you also want to be sort of gently offering new ideas. Usually I find doing it in the form of like a question, like, hey, have you thought about this? Is that possible? Huh, maybe you're right, I don't know. That kind of approach I find to be quite effective across time.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is respect, compassion, consistency, sharing of trusted information, encouraging people to seek out trusted information, I guess different than what they just saw on YouTube yesterday, because sometimes that's a big issue, and to not think that it's going to change overnight.
Yeah.
That it's in the long haul. You chip away step by step at a time.
Yeah.
And I think a key part is digestible information.
Right.
You know, if people are finding information on YouTube, there should be accessible, fact-based, evidence-based information available on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
And so it's meeting people where they are. In this case, you know, I was talking about an initiative called Science at First, that's social media based, but in the case in community, it's literally maybe in person meeting people where they are as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the other areas that I've heard people chat about is sharing information on social media. It's so easy, you know. You see something, click, especially if it makes you feel good, or if it you know, engenders one of those responses that Anthony was talking about. Click, repeat, you know, whatever. How should people be looking at what comes across their Twitter feed or their Facebook feed or their Instagram feed? How should people approach that kind of information? Any ideas or suggestions?
Yeah, a rule of thumb that I try to use to apply to myself is to, before I hit send, I kind of take a minute to breathe and notice how I'm feeling. And if I notice that I feel outraged or furious, then I always wait to send it, because misinformation is frequently tied to stories that are designed to outrage us and enrage us. And we know from all kinds of metrics that those kinds of stories propagate the furthest and the fastest. And so if I notice that I'm outraged, I could easily be fanning the flames and making the problem worse. So as soon as I notice that, I'll think to myself, how do I know that this is true? Have I checked this against some of the reputable kinds of sites or sources that you might find on Science Up First or other kinds of reputable sources? So that's my rule of thumb.
Oh, that's a really good one. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say a variation of the, you know, check then share. There's actually great kind of educational resources out there. Media Smarts has some great material. University of Alberta, you know, Science Up First. You know, if you see a sensational headline, sometimes it's just easy to hit the share without even reading beyond the headline. And it's tempting. Sometimes even when I think, oh, this is great information, I'm like, I always pause. I always read the article. Because when you're sharing something in a way, you are endorsing it. And your endorsement can be personal, you know, and it can make a difference in someone else's life. You know, maybe it's a close friend or a colleague or something. So going beyond, you know, pausing, going beyond the headline, reading it, questioning, taking Anthony's mindset of curiosity of, are these reputable sources? When it comes to health misinformation, is this the consensus? Is this one opinion? Is this one study? Or is this the body of consensus across the scientific community? And I think that's something, you know, when you're pausing, it's like, okay, I'm going to pause and digest.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I can recall I had a beloved uncle who was a banker. So this is a banking analogy. But he said to me, Stan, he said, do you know what the most valuable thing you have in your life? And then I was, no, what is it? He said that your signature. Because that tells people that you're standing behind whatever is on that document. And so sharing, it occurs to me that sharing stuff on social media is like you putting your signature on a contract.
Yeah. It really does matter a lot, you know? I would have said my Sony PlayStation, but signature is probably...
I never had a Sony PlayStation. On the other hand, yeah.
But no, I really agree. I mean, I think that we underestimate the network influences that each of us can have. I've never been to Madagascar, but I believe that Madagascar exists, that it's a real place, and it's because I trust the people around me who have told me that it is. And so people around you, they trust the people who are closest around you, really trust you. That's part of what it means to be close to people. And so when you share a piece of information, it makes it very compelling to all the people in your immediate network. If you notice like that you want to send a story along and you haven't read it, and you're like, oh, I don't have time to read this, or I don't want to read it right now, then don't send it till you've read it. That's another problem.
That's why I have 24 tabs.
Yeah. I've got so many things I'm going to say.
Well, no, that's really good advice. And if you get the affective surge, that's a signal. Be careful, and before you send something, read it first. That's always really good. But it's important, because it is. You both pointed out that it is you that's sending it.
Yeah, and I think there's oddly maybe some shortcuts there. Like when we're really talking about trust in people. And what about trust in organizations? So I represent a network of highly trusted organizations across the country, like amongst the highest. Science centers and science museums rank like super high in terms of where the public trusts science information coming from. And that's because there's a process in place, internally, that people trust that it's going to be accurate information. It's been vetted. It's going to be communicated in a way that's accessible. There's assumptions there that they're doing the work. The Science Up First initiative is kind of an offshoot of that philosophy that the work is being done. Anything that's shared has been vetted, by scientists, and it's tackling kind of misinformation. So, in a way, I feel like sometimes we can make those shortcuts to reference who we trust as organizations.
I really love that, Marianne. I think that it's entirely accurate. The organizations that I trust the most certainly are the ones that I know have a rigorous process in place to vet information. And I know that the Science at First Network has, dozens and dozens of people with backgrounds in immunology and virology and you name it, like public health. And so that collection of perspectives to critically think about anything we send out before we send it, like that's really valuable. And so organizations that do that sort of thing, that's why I trust the enterprise of science, is because that's the way that it's organized around that process.
Yeah.
I think that's so important, but I want to just raise a little caveat here and a concern and see what you guys think of that.
Please do. More perspectives, the merrier.
If you ask me what organizations, I trust the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. That's the college I belong to, and I know who they do and what they stand for, etc. I trust the College of Family Physicians. I trust the College of Nurses, but not all people trust those organizations, because some people, for example, have had negative experiences, or they come from groups that have been marginalized, that have been treated harshly, treated unfairly by organizations that we should be trusting, and that has cultural roots. It has all sorts of other baggage, and I don't mean baggage in a negative way. I mean it in a positive way. What's in your knapsack? It's my life experiences. It's the experience of my group. It's the experience of people who've been disadvantaged, who've been marginalized.
Right.
So where do we go with that?
Yeah, you cannot assume the trust is there.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's where those organizations, those institutions, a heavy burden rests on their shoulders to make the effort to go out and reach out. And trust is something that's earned. It's not just granted willy-nilly, right? So in those cases where, various marginalized groups have been disadvantaged or harmed in some way by, antiquated practices that science used to subscribe to. Well, we can do things about that. We are obliged to do things about that, namely going out into the community and making sure that our first and top priority is to serve those communities, and to make sure that our behavior reflects that at every level of an organization, and to do so transparently. It's a trickier problem.
Yeah, and bringing like the qualities you mentioned, Anthony, like the listening, the empathy, the curiosity, the trust. It's reciprocal. You know, we trust that those experiences through the listening, like they're real, um, and need to be addressed.
You know, one of the strategies that I personally am adopting with my PhD research and with my organization is to reach out to some of those specifically marginalized communities and to just engage them in conversation where it is at least typically science communicators of the olden times, it's just one-way communication, and I really don't know that that model works when there's not trust. So rebuilding trust requires dialogue, us understanding one another. I don't just speak to you, I listen. And so we're putting together a series of events that are based around that with a new platform we've developed called Freestyle Socials, where it's really, we'll just ask a two-sided question, you know, should we design our kids' DNA? We're starting to use CRISPR to play with DNA of various species, not humans, but that's not far down the road. We ask those kinds of open-ended questions, and we invite those community members in to not hear what's possible and what scientists or science thinks should be done, but those conversations need to be shaped by what the public thinks as well. I think the way I like to summarize this is I think science can tell us what's possible, but society has to decide what's right. And I think holding that value up as a beacon can help to rebuild some of the trust with those communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. One of the things that I need to reflect on, and I'll do it verbally right now, is that science isn't perfect. We make mistakes, but science is a self-correcting discipline.
Yeah.
And I have never been in a room of scientists where everybody was in that room agrees on everything. That's not how science works. And I think sometimes the fact that scientists can disagree with each other, makes people distrustful of science, because they think, my gosh, if you're all scientists, you should all agree on everything all the time. But we don't.
Yeah,
So
and
how do you address that?
Well, I think this speaks to science literacy, like how you started this conversation. What is science literacy? It's also the understanding of the scientific process. And I think if that's one thing, well, not one, but so many things, but that this pandemic has highlighted, is that need. It's smacking us in the face. Everyone is suddenly living and within the scientific process without realizing it. And it's kind of like the black box is lifted. This is what it actually looks like. You know, it's messy. It's really messy. Normally that's reserved for scientific conferences.
Yeah.
You know, and suddenly it's in the public domain, and the public wasn't ready. You know, there's a real gap there in that support of science communication with the public. And I think the pandemic has highlighted that. I think this is work that we need to support more in Canada across many topics. But I think initiatives like this one, one thing I found incredible during the pandemic is the network of grassroots organizations that have stepped up to fill this need. You know, Vaccine Hunters, COVID-19 Resources Canada, This Is Our Shot, Science Up First, Vax Facts. You know, there's this whole network that has filled this void and is in this time of need. Now let's continue supporting what this movement that's started.
Yeah. And I mean, to add to that, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I'm optimistic in a time that it's hard to be optimistic. But because of that, I think that, you know, humanity is pretty good at figuring it out just before we die. We've done that a lot of times. And I think that part of how we do that is by enshrining the scientific process and the values that undergird it into our culture. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what science culture is. In other countries, it's so ingrained into the culture, they have a word for it. And I would love to see that happen in Canada, because I think that goes a long way towards treating the illness rather than just the symptoms. To me, misinformation and its spread is a symptom, but the deeper illness is our lack of understanding of the scientific process, and more than that, our lack of capacity to embody it at the moment. So when I science culture is a very nebulous, kind of fuzzy idea. What does it mean, really? Well, if culture is a collection of values and ideas and beliefs that are shared by people across time, then science culture is a collection of values, ideas, and beliefs that are supportive of good science. And I think there are a couple of them that we really, that I'm certainly aiming to ingrain into our society more so. And I'm excited that each of the organizations that Marianne mentioned are doing precisely the same thing. So I think, curiosity, collaboration, calm, creativity, courage, all of these values are indispensable to good scientific thinking. And I'm confident we can build a culture that is a shining example of each of those.
That, you raise another really interesting point, and I just want to share with you an anecdote. I got asked a while back by a colleague of mine. We were discussing about the science and the vaccines and all those different things, and we were talking about why scientists aren't always the same. And this person said, in a bit of a frustrated tone, he said, "Well, what does science actually mean?" Well, that's a good question. I'll reflect on that a bit. And then I said, I think it means that I have more comfort that I'm less likely to be wrong more often than not. which then he looked at me and said, "That's not a ringing endorsement." But it's sort of true, right?
It really is. I think the expectation that we have societally is that science means facts, right? Like I have a fact, then I have science. I've got a chunk of science in front of you that I can throw at you. But science is not it's not about certainty, it's about probabilities. So, is gravity real? I think, is there a 100% chance that gravity is real? No, I'd say there's a 99.999999999% chance that it's real.
You don't want to test it by walking off a tall building.
Yeah. It's because chances are it's not going to go good. So,
but it's interesting because scientists, their job is to say what they will describe that 0.00001, like what that issue is. And right now, like what we're talking about is the public is seeing that, but without understanding the context.
Exactly.
Right. And so somehow these really low risk or improbable things or involved in the process of science are getting the same airtime as the consensus building stuff in science. So, when we talk to science culture in Canada and structure in society, there's a lot of work to be done. Science has lived in the domain of academia in a relatively closed environment. And the bridges outward to policymakers or to industry, not as much to the public. And suddenly we're like frantically building these bridges, right? And so when we want to get to that culture piece, we really got to think about structures, and connecting.
This is me rolling up my sleeves.
Oh, I love it.
The hard work. Let's get to work.
So one of the things actually taking away from this discussion, which is about how individuals can address the infodemic, is it's interesting that we came here because that I hadn't even thought about this when we started, is that we all need to have a better understanding of what the scientific enterprise is and what it is not, and accept it for its successes and realize that it can have failures, but it is a self-correcting discipline.
Yeah.
Right. So it comes back and improves things. It changes things. It's not an immutable thing. Right.
Yeah. And the process does allow for consensus building.
Yes. Yeah. Can you say more about that? Because I think that's so important.
Yeah. Like the scientific process, it's not one person in one lab.
That's so
important. And it's not national. It's international. It's global. Yeah. And when we talk about the scientific enterprise, it is, all of these publications that are reviewed by other scientists. And that's how, the studies get published. And so it's really looking at the collection of body work. Again, the challenges come back to communicating that information. That is a very specific language. It's filled with jargon. It's, in different disciplines. And how do we share that in a responsible way? with the general public.
Yeah, I think that consensus building piece, that international collaboration to build consensus is really the core of what I hope people walk away understanding, is that, each experiment makes us a little more sure that gravity is real.
Yeah. Like, I think the scientific, I think you used the phrasing, Senator, enterprise is incredible.
Yeah.
What we have, it is incredible.
It's the best.
We can add to that. We can add in the science communication to that. I think that's where progress is yet to happen, like more progress.
Yeah.
Look, I'm just looking at the time. We're over time. Yeah, oh my gosh, sorry about that. Sorry to our viewers. Look, I'm just going to try to wrap this. There are lots of things that, from what we heard, that individuals can do, both for themselves, how to find the best available science, how to talk to people so that it helps them use the best available science, how to better understand the culture of science, organizations around science, and how to better understand science itself. And in some ways, we might think that this pandemic is actually an opportunity,
yes,
for not just Canadians, but all the citizens of the world to be able to become more fully engaged with and communicate better with science.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, it's been just delightful seeing both of you again.
A real pleasure.
And I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to chat. And thanks again to all those people who have taken the time to look at this on Facebook or Twitter, and encouraging everyone to find out what's going on in Science Literacy Week. The Canadian Association of Science Centers have a gazillion things happening. And then Anthony, I'm sure, has another gazillion things happening. So get out there and get science, or whatever. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. All right.